Chapter 25, The Sixties, 1960 to 1968, Part 3 and 4. Part 3. Unlike Kennedy, who came from a wealthy and powerful family and seemed to view success as a birthright, Lyndon B Johnson grew up poor in the impoverished Texas Hill Country and struggled to achieve wealth and power. By the 1950s, he was majority leader of the U.S. Senate, but he never forgot the poor white and Mexican children he had taught in the 1930s. More than Kennedy, he was committed to the New Deal social programs that assisted the less fortunate. Immediately upon taking office, Johnson called on Congress to enact the Civil Rights Bill that Kennedy had championed. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which barred racial discrimination in employment, institutions like hospitals and schools, and privately owned public accommodations like restaurants, hotels, and theater. It also banned discriminations on grounds of sex, although this provision was added to by opponents of the civil rights who hoped to derail the bill and embraced by liberal and female members of Congress. Johnson knew that many whites opposed the law, and he feared the South would turn Republican. But the 1964 law did not address blacks' right to vote in the South. That summer, a coalition of civil rights groups started a voter registration drive in Mississippi. Hundreds of white college students from the North traveled to take part in the campaign, called Freedom Summer. Violence was quick and deadly, including bombings, beatings, and the murder of 3 civil rights workers, 2 white and 1 black, near Philadelphia, Mississippi. Though many black civil rights workers had been killed, the deaths of the 2 white youths grabbed national attention and revealed federal indifference to violence against citizens claiming their rights. Freedom Summer also led to the dramatic campaign by the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or the MFDP, to take the seats of the state's all-white official party at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. As blacks were barred from democratic activities or registering to vote, civil rights activists created the MFDP, open to all citizens. Fannie Lou Hamer of the MFDP captivated the country in televised hearings in which she recounted her history of poverty and beatings by police for civil rights work. Johnson feared that Southern Democrats would abandon the party if the MFDP delegates were seated, and the MFDP rejected a compromise to seat only 2 black delegates. The 1964 Democratic Convention weakened blacks' faith that they could use the political system and foretold the break between Democratic liberals and the civil rights movement. But the civil rights movement rallied behind Johnson's campaign for re-election. Johnson faced Republican candidate and Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, whose 1960 book, The Conscience of a Conservative, had sold more than 3 million copies. Goldwater demanded a more aggressive Cold War stance, but mostly criticized internal threats to freedom, especially the New Deal welfare state. He called for private charity to replace public welfare and Social Security, and the abolition of the graduated income tax. Goldwater also voted against the 1964 Civil Rights Act, but Democrats' portrayal of Goldwater as an extremist who would abolish Social Security and risk nuclear war won Johnson an overwhelming victory. Democrats also took 2-to-1 majorities in both houses of Congress. But the 1964 campaign also launched the modern conservative movement. Goldwater carried 5 Deep South states, and the segregationist Democratic governor of Alabama, George Wallace, had done well in primaries in northern states such as Indiana and Wisconsin. Also, in 1964, California voters approved Proposition 14, which repealed a 1963 law that banned racial discrimination in real estate sales, celebrated by conservatives as a move that would give white homeowners freedom against government interference. The Goldwater campaign and other stirrings showed that the 60s had a conservative side. In 1960, students inspired by conservative intellectual William F. Buckley gathered at his home in Sharon, Connecticut, and formed the Young Americans for Freedom. The YAF's Sharon Statement advocated the free market as the basis of personal freedom, limited government, and the destruction of global communism in the Cold War. YAF members became Goldwater's shock troops in his campaign. Goldwater also found support in the suburbs of California and the Southwest, where immigrants from elsewhere in the U.S. had come to work in defense-related industries. These suburbanites were the base for later conservative insurgencies. Goldwater's winning of 5 Deep South states also showed that Republicans might take advantage of white resentments against civil rights and move the South away from the Democrats. Although conservatives in the 1960s would abandon blatant language of racial superiority and inferiority, their calls for law and order and their stigmatization of welfare had strong racial overtones. In early 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. launched a voting rights drive in Selma, Alabama. Defying a ban by Governor Wallace, King tried to lead a march from Selma to the state capital, Montgomery. State police met the marches with cattle prods, whips, and tear gas. Once more, images of brutal police attacks on non-violent demonstrators flashed on televisions worldwide. The government was forced to take action, and Johnson quickly asked Congress to pass a law securing the right to vote. Congress soon enacted the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which allowed federal officials to register voters. Black Southerners finally regained the suffrage that had been denied them since the end of the 19th century. The 24th Amendment to the Constitution also outlawed the poll tax, which had prevented poor blacks and some whites from voting in the South. By 1965, the belief spread by the civil rights movement that racism could no longer create second-class citizens affected other policy debates. In 1965, the Hart-Celler Act ended the national origins quota system of immigration that had excluded Asians and restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. The law established new, racially neutral criteria for immigration, including family reunification and the demand for skills needed in America. Yet, because of growing hostility in the Southwest to Mexican immigration, the law for the first time sharply limited immigration from the Western Hemisphere to 120,000 per year. This provision created the category of illegal aliens for migrants from elsewhere in the Americas. The law set the quota for the rest of the world at 170,000 per year. Exceptions for refugees from communist countries soon let immigration exceed the limits. Although immigrants were only 5% of the nation's population at the time, the reform caused a drastic shift in the sources of immigration to Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia. After his 1964 election victory, Johnson outlined the greatest plan for government action to promote the general welfare since the New Deal. Johnson's programs of 1965 through 1967, known as the Great Society, provided health services to the poor and elderly in the new Medicaid and Medicare programs and poured federal funds into education and urban development. New cabinet-level offices, such as the Departments of Transportation and Housing and Urban Development, and new agencies such as the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission and a national public broadcasting network were established. These measures greatly expanded the federal government's powers and completed and extended the social agenda, except national health insurance, that had stalled in Congress since 1938. Yet the Great Society was a response to prosperity, not depression. In the mid-1960s, the economy was expanding, fueled by higher government spending and a tax cut for individuals and businesses passed in 1964. Johnson and Democratic liberals believed economic growth would fund more government programs and improve Americans' quality of life. The War on Poverty was the centerpiece of the Great Society. Launched in 1964, this effort was inspired in part by politicians' rediscovery of poverty amid 1950s affluence. In 1962, Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, showed that 40 to 50 million Americans still lived in poverty in urban and rural areas removed from middle-class life and consciousness. Harrington showed that the mechanization of agriculture and automation of industry had cut jobs for the unskilled. The civil rights movement highlighted the problem of poverty for blacks, but Harrington showed the majority of the poor were white. While Democrats during the New Deal had attributed poverty to an imbalance of economic power and flawed economic institutions, the Johnson administration believed poverty was caused by a lack of skills and proper attitudes and work habits. The War on Poverty did not directly fight poverty through efforts like works programs, spreading unions, or preventing businesses from moving production to the low-wage South or overseas. It did not address economic changes that reduced well-paid factory jobs and left poor rural and urban families with few opportunities. Perhaps the most successful and popular program was food stamps, a form of direct aid. But the War on Poverty sought to equip the poor with skills and motivate them. A new Office of Economic Opportunity created Head Start, which was early childhood education, job training, legal services, college scholarships, and volunteers in service to America, or VISTA, a domestic version of the Peace Corps. It also created community action programs that required the poor people participate in forming local policies, which fostered resentment among local officials used to controlling federal funds. Johnson defended the Great Society in a New Deal language of freedom reinforced by the Civil Rights Movement. Recognizing that black poverty caused by past and present racism was different from white poverty, he tried to redefine the relationship between freedom and equality. He argued that economic liberty was more than equal opportunity. But while Johnson's Great Society may not have achieved equality, it did reaffirm the idea of social citizenship. It was the greatest effort in American history to mobilize the powers of the federal government to aid the less fortunate Americans, especially those, like blacks, who had been excluded by original New Deal entitlements like Social Security. Combined with incredible economic growth, the war on poverty reduced poverty rates from 22 to 13% of American families during the 1960s. But the amount spent on the programs was too low to end poverty or transform life in poor urban areas. By the 1990s, the historic gap between whites and blacks in education, income, and access to skilled jobs had greatly narrowed. But deindustrialization and urban decay, combined with residential segregation, kept the wealth of white households 10 times as great as that of blacks and left nearly a quarter of all black children in poverty. Part 4. The civil rights movement entered a crisis when it moved from demanding access to schools, public facilities, and voting booths to economic disparities between blacks and whites. In the mid-1960s, economic problems became a civil rights priority. Violence in northern ghettos brought attention to racial injustice and inequalities in jobs, education, and housing, which the end of legal segregation didn't solve. The hostility of later race relations emerged from many whites' belief that blacks had won equality in civil rights and voting rights laws and needed no further assistance, while blacks, aware of discrimination in jobs, education, housing, and the criminal justice system, called for more government action. The first riots, actually battles between blacks and mostly white police, erupted in Harlem in 1964. The larger uprising of 1965 in Watts, the black ghetto of Los Angeles, saw 50,000 rioters attack police and firemen, loot white-owned businesses, and burn buildings. After the National Guard restored order, 35 had been killed, 900 injured, and $20 million in property destroyed. By the summer of 1967, urban riots seemed everywhere. Some feared racial war. Urban rebellions left 23 dead in Newark and 43 in Detroit, huge parts of which were devastated. Johnson appointed a commission to study the causes of urban disorder, whose report blamed them on segregation and poverty, indicated white racism, and claimed that the society was becoming harshly divided on racial lines. The civil rights movement, knowing black unemployment was twice that of whites and that the average black family had little more than half the income of white families, moved to address economic freedom for black Americans. In 1964, King called for a Bill of Rights that would offer positive economic rights to African Americans, what would become affirmative action. In 1966, he launched the Chicago Freedom Movement, demanding an end to discrimination by employers and unions, equal access to mortgages, the integration of public housing, and decentralized low-income housing. But King's movement was no match for the political machine of Chicago's mayor, Richard J. Daley, a white homeowner who fiercely opposed him. King's nonviolent attacks failed in the North. King became more radical and started to call for a better distribution of wealth for all God's children. If the early civil rights movement had clear objectives and profound accomplishment, the latter movement saw political fragmentation and few victories. Even during the height of the integration struggles, the incendiary orator Malcolm X insisted that blacks must control the political and economic resources of their own communities and avoid working with whites. Named Malcolm Little, when as a youth he committed several crimes, Malcolm X converted in jail to the Nation of Islam, or black Muslims, who preached a message of white evil and black discipline. Malcolm dropped his slave surname in favor of X, symbolizing black separation from African ancestry. Released from prison, Malcolm X became a spokesman for the Muslims as a vehement critic of the integrationism and nonviolence of King and the civil rights movement. Unlike King, Malcolm X saw nothing redemptive in American values. On a 1964 trip to Mecca, Islam's spiritual center, Malcolm X saw interracial harmony between Muslims and moderated his message, embracing the possibility of interracial cooperation for radical change in America. But his assassination in early 1965 left no consistent ideology or organization behind. His calls for black independence inspired the urban poor and younger civil rights activists, and his 1966 autobiography became a bestseller. Malcolm X was the father of Black Power, a slogan popularized by SNCC leader Stokely Carmichael in 1966 during a march in Mississippi. Black Power rallied those angry with the federal government's failure to stop violence against civil rights activists, white attempts to dominate the movement, and the movement's inability to influence the economic plight of urban blacks. Black Power suggested everything from electing more blacks to political office to the belief that blacks were a colonized people whose freedom could be won only through revolutionary struggles for self-determination. The idea reflected the radicalization of young civil rights activists and inspired cultural pride. The word Negro was abandoned for Afro-American, and African dress and hairstyles were celebrated. Previously interracial civil rights groups like SNCC and CORE also repudiated their inclusion of whites, and they soon disintegrated. New groups sprang up, however, most prominently the Black Panther Party, formed in Oakland, California in 1966 to protest police brutality. The Black Panthers won notoriety for advocating armed self-defense, and their militant stance and actions alarmed moderate blacks and many whites. Troubled by internal disputes and police and FBI repression, the Black Panthers disintegrated by the early 1970s.